Thank you very much. Just by way of introduction, I've been a beekeeper since 1974, but only in the past few years have I really become more conscious of all the other types of bees and pollinators. So I think, one of the things that's exciting about, becoming, connected with partners is learning more about other bees and the contribution that all the other pollinators make. And the program that you talked about that Frederick was going to do is called Pollinator Panorama. So I hope you guys will all stay for that because I brought a lot of pictures of all the different types of pollinators and the different types of flowers that they visit. But anyway, so this particular presentation I'm going to do this morning was inspired by one of the professors at Cornell. I'm not a professor. I played one on TV, but I'm not a professor. One of the professors at Cornell was quoted in the newspapers as saying, was quoted in the, I like that better, was quoted in the newspaper as saying that the settlers brought the honeybees here to pollinate the fruit. And I thought, you should know better than that. The settlers did not bring the honeybees here to pollinate because, first of all, there were already plenty of bees in the New World before the settlers came. And second of all, they didn't know that bees pollinated. They did not know this until very later on. So anyway, I was inspired to write an article for the American Bee Journal. If you don't subscribe to the American Bee Journal, I recommend it because that's the only place I write. And I like people to read what I write. I don't know what is the point of writing it if no one's reading it. So anyway, in the article that I wrote, I started out with a short history of pollination. I started out around 1700s. But I'm going to go back a little bit further than that. So it becomes a little bit longer in time frame. I'm going to try to speed it up. So we're going to go back to the beginning. No, it didn't really start out this way. A lot of people would like to start it out this way. But the reason why I'm putting up this picture is because it holds a little secret. And that's the fact that they don't like talking about sex. It's covered up nicely here with band. Pollination is all about sex. So if there's anybody here that's not, comfortable hearing about sex, you might as well leave now. So going back to the real beginning, we believe that life was created or originated in the ocean. And in the ocean, it was very easy to fertilize because the sperm just swam out in the water and they swam around and they found the females. It's a pretty easy setup. But the thing that people don't think about is that even the smallest sperm is looking for something. They don't have eyes, but they have sensory organs. And so sex is basically about attraction and recombination of genes and survival of the fittest. So when the sperm goes out into the water, immediately he's encountering an obstacle to survive that water and find his way to the egg. So this is an algae. I'm not going to read these things. You can read these if you want to. So the earliest plant life that was involved with fertilization that we know of is algae, and algae still exists. So you can find examples of all of these things in the current world. Algae and all the different primitive flowers, spores, bacteria, they all have some kind of fertilization process going on. But of course, we're mostly interested in complicated flowers. This shows where the land plants sort of fit in with aquatic plants. And still, all the plant life on the planet is aquatic. So here's an example of a very early type of flower. These things were not pollinated by these flies. These flies were attracted because they actually, insects became attracted to the plants early on because they were hungry and they ate these plants. Of course, it's not good for the plant to be eaten by an insect, so they started developing ways of diverting the plants or else poisoning the plants. And a lot of plants are poisonous, so that when the insect eats it, they die. That's a good way of getting rid of plant pests. Another way is to offer them some kind of reward. And so one of the rewards that early on plants started providing was nectar. And they were already using fluids in the process of fertilization. As we talked about before, fertilization is very easy to do in a fluid environment. So when you get out into the air, when the plants moved out onto the land, a lot of plants produce their own fluid to move the sperm around or to attract the sperm, which are no longer able to swim once they're out of the fluid. So here's an interesting fossil. It's really cool that we have fossil records, because otherwise we would know nothing at all about what was going on millions and millions of years ago. And some of these things are marvelously preserved, right down to the point where they can count the wing veins, et cetera, et cetera. Here, it's much more rare to find fossilized flowers because they're so delicate. So we're really fortunate to be able to have these examples of fossilized flowers. Insects are a lot more commonly found in amber, and there's some remarkably preserved specimens of insects in amber. And I don't know if you've ever bought an insect in amber. It's really cool. I bought it when I was like 10 million years old or 100 million years old, whatever. You know, just to look at it and think that thing was around hundreds of millions of years ago is really kind of impressive. So anyway, the ancients, the Greeks, and the cultures living in Mesopotamia knew a lot more about this stuff than later cultures, Islam and Christianity. These religious cultures, a lot of them suppressed knowledge. They burned libraries. So much of the ancient knowledge was lost in these various crusades and wars and pillaging, etc. So one of the things that we think that was widely known was that date palms required the pollen to be transferred from the male to the female parts. And this was known then. And then forgotten. What was along with a lot of those things. Another thing that's really interesting about the ancients, especially the Egyptians, they were pretty well convinced that the big bee, the big bee in the hive, the king, right? And to the extent that they're hierarchy for king and the big bee, it's the same. The pharaoh is considered the king of the hive. And this persisted for a very long time. It took a long time for people to let go of the idea that the boss is not a guy. So, anyway, people started to rediscover these things. This particular guy, I don't know what it was about Latin. All these guys wanted to have Latin names. This guy's name was Camaro, and he changed it to Camerarius. To be more, scientific. Anyway, when the microscope was discovered, they began to really look closely at things, and they started to see that there was a huge similarity between plant fertilization and animal fertilization. That these things are not materially different. They're done in a different way, of course. And one of the stumbling blocks, of course, is that plants can't move. If you can't move, you can't, find a mate. How you pull that off, right? So then it's this guy was a school teacher, older, and evidently one of those kind of school teachers that was really heavy with paddle, and his master's said, "We got to find something else for this guy to do." And he's intense. He's good, but not with kids. So he was reassigned. He's found his place in studying plants. Check my notes. According to my notes, Sprangle is a lot more important than Cold River. Sprangle. If you ever get a chance to see his illustrations, he spent millions and millions of hours drawing the most intricate examples of flowers that he found in his environment. And he pretty much mapped out the whole idea of fertilization of plants. But these people were working in very closed environments. They didn't communicate a lot. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have journals. So this information took a long time to get distributed. And then, of course, it was so complicated and technical that only a few people would get interested in it. And it took a long time to make it move out. Just a close-up of the intricate flowers that he studied and how fascinated he was with the fact that, I mean, there's not one way to create a flower. There's not one way to get this job done. There's just millions of different ways of doing exactly the same thing. But, so, is that a little fuzzy? Yeah, okay. So what he's saying here is bees are far more useful creatures than was thought of. And he was really interested in beekeeping because he felt that beekeeping was very important for the well-being of the entire society. So he encouraged beekeeping, and to the point where he actually recommended that there be a standing army of beekeepers ready to defend the state and the state's interests. And I find it very interesting that whenever people get around honeybees, they start getting socialist ideas. Here's this organization that, it seems to be getting the job done. And the queen is really, once they figured out the queen, how it came, she's really not the boss. She's really not overseeing any of this. That, I like to say that we've got, 50,000 individuals all working in harmony without any leadership because they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. Anyway, there's a monument was erected for Sprengel, and if you look at it closely, there's some really nice illustrations based on his line drawings that are in his books. And a lot of this stuff you can find online now. Google, God bless their heart, they have scanned hundreds of millions of books by now. And a lot of the stuff that's in public domain is just got gorgeous illustrations. I really find it very fascinating that you can find this stuff. Mendel, anyone not know Mendel? Okay, so Mendel is, I know about you guys. We learned about Mendel in elementary school, bees and stuff. Mendel was also had bees. See, he was very interested in the idea that studying fertilization and genetics, which hadn't been named yet. He was studying genetics. He didn't know that because we hadn't given him a name. He was interested in studying with animals too, but he was a monk living in a monastery. That was a good idea for a man of the cloth, spent too much time thinking about sex. So again here, sex is suppressed and discoveries are not made because those are areas where we don't look. Anyway, he did have hives. The picture on the right is actually contemporary. It's taken in Greece. And that's his workshop, his honey house or bee house. And that's still there. So again, it's the same story. Mendel, working by himself in the monastery, made these fabulous discoveries about genetics that would have really, shed a light on a lot of what we were learning at the time about evolution, but the word didn't get out. There's a lot of evidence that Darwin never heard of Mendel never heard of Darwin, and they just didn't work in the same circles, in the same language. But Darwin really was the one that realized that all over the world you find a whole different, in each region you find a whole different set of plants, animals, etc. They all seem to be ideally suited to that region. And a lot of times when they moved to other regions, for example, the Europeans wanted to bring everything to Europe, the New World, and repopulate it. And a lot of these things, when they're brought to new regions, they don't do well, or else they do too well and become invasive. So anyway, as a world traveler, he was able to see in all these different regions, South America, all over the world, and discovered these things. And one of the things that he realized was that there was this relationship between plants and pollinators, that each one of them was responding to pressures from the other. In other words, plants were producing forms and products in response to what the pollinators wanted. The pollinators were doing things at the bidding of the plants. For example, carrying the pollen from one plant to another. Now, there's a lot of plants that we know are self-fertilizing. They can pollinate themselves. But there are also, I'll get into that later, there's a lot of plants that require cross-pollination between different plants and also even different varieties. But anyway, this is one of the things that fascinated Darwin, the intricate shapes that plants produce to attract insects. So these plants, in their own way, they know what insects are interested in. This is what will draw them. And of course, the way we describe this is as having evolved through natural selection. In other words, a plant that is more attractive to insects is going to be visited more often by insects, and therefore it's going to produce more offspring. A plant that's dowdy and not putting out is going to fall off the map. That's one of the things that people forget is that extinction that's how life works. Some make it, some don't. And here's another example of an artist taking on the job of trying to depict the beauty of nature, just the interesting complexity of it. I mean, why on earth are there so many different flowers, so many different colors, so many different shapes? I mean, like, one of my favorite things is biodiversity. People say, well, we have to have as much biodiversity as possible. I mean, it's amazing how much biodiversity there already is. But the amount of diversity that we have is way more than what's needed for the functioning of the planet. I mean, you could have 100 million species, and that's a lot of species, but do we need 1 billion species? What's going on there? What's going on there is that the driving force of evolution created. So there's novelties. And once novelty became, natural selection selected for novelty. So novelty is one of those things that drives species forward. So that's really about the only way you can account for that. All of life and creation is so weird. Anyway, so it took a long time for the idea of pollination to catch on. And I got tons of notes here, but these are straight. Ground zero for pollination, the study of pollination and its relationship to authors was Ithaca, where I'm from. And there's reasons for this. New York State was actually at the forefront of beekeeping in general. Beekeeping started in the Hudson Valley, and there was word coming that upstate New York, where I'm from, there was vast acreages of clover and buckwheat, and beekeepers started moving up into the upstate region, and they were producing more honey than had ever been produced in the world before. They were mass-producing hives and multiplying the colonies, and they had just millions of acres of clover and buckwheat, like I said, and apples. So the beekeeping really got off the ground in upstate New York. And the apple region, the biggest apple producing region in the country, probably the world, in the 1800s was upstate New York, not California or Oregon or Washington. That came later. So it's logical that the major discoveries would be made in that environment. So this Fletcher, I guess it's kind of fuzzy, I'm sorry. The last time I did this presentation, the screen was as big as this whole wall. And so I'm a little at a disadvantage. I would have made the text a little bit larger. But anyway, the drift of it is that they began printing handbooks on advising people on the necessity of having pollination and the ideal way of getting pollination that they thought at the time was to truck bees in. Now, we've learned as time's gone on that in many regions the pollination can be done adequately by native bees, but that's an interesting topic on its own, which I'm not going to get into. What really got beekeeping off the map was the work of A.I. Root. And he, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, people began to mass produce things like, look at these chairs, they're all the same. can mass-produce chairs, you can mass-produce books, you can mass-produce beehives, and it really made the whole endeavor much easier to do and more successful. So people were making huge quantities of honey and selling it downstate to the New York City, Philadelphia, and Boston markets. But even in the early editions of the ABCXYZ, everybody knows about the ABCXYZ. This book was started in the 1860s, 1870s, and even in the early editions, there was very little mention of pollination. It wasn't really until after about 1900 that they started writing about the value of pollination and making suggestions like maybe orchard growers own bees, get their pollination done. And this is a picture of AI Roots Factory. This is 1900. This is really what got beekeeping going as a career, not just a hobby. I'm a hobby beekeeper, so don't get me wrong. I don't, glorify commercial beekeeping or hobby beekeeping. I've done both. So before migratory beekeeping was common, it was extremely common for a beekeeper to have all of his hives at home. This was upstate New York again. Alexander was surrounded by acres and acres of clover and buckwheat, and this was Dutch clover was grown for dairy farming, and the buckwheat, of course, was grown for the Europeans that were coming over from over by the millions to create buckwheat. That's the staple food that they ate in the old country. So there was a huge market for it. Both of those plants are no longer widespread at all in my area. It was formerly called the white clover buckwheat region. Now it's mostly forest. There's some corn that's grown. It's just pretty much gone back to the woods, which is the way we like it. I can't really imagine just driving for hours and hours and not seeing any trees. But at one point, around 1900, most of the trees in upstate New York were gone. They cut them down to clear land, of course, but also the beginning of the Industrial Revolution was fired with wood. So before they started mining coal in earnest, it was wood fired and steam engines. Even railroad trains were fired with wood. So anyway, we had enough bees, but the issue was to get the bees into the orchards. So that required vehicles. Here's a modern truck. And the caption, I don't know if you can read the caption. This guy transported his hives 50 miles without losing a single colony or breaking a single comb. This was a feat. This is probably in the 1950s, but looking at the truck, any experts on trucks here can identify? Oh, yeah, 40s, yeah, 40s. Well, the truck may be 30s, but they may have an old truck. And it's netted, which is interesting. I did pollination back in the 80s, and a lot of times beekeepers would move hives without nets, put 100, 200 colonies on a truck, and just drive all night. This guy decided to keep the bees in the truck. This is very common in Eastern Europe. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is that the bees are already removed. You want to go from one honey flow to another. The other is it's very difficult to steal these hives. You'd have to steal the whole truck, which I'm sure that happens too. And this is what you guys are accustomed to out here in California. This is a California. This is a California holding yard where they bring bees from all over the country and put them in holding yards and get ready to move out into the almonds. Any questions at this point? Okay, so McGregor is really the one that made a sort of a life work about studying pollination and pollination requirements of the various plants. And you can still get this. This book is now, it's been reprinted by Bee Culture has reprinted this book, but it's also available online. The entire text is available online. And you can see how he studied every single cultivated plant that was being raised in the United States, and delineated the pollination requirements of each one of these plants. And so, it makes fascinating reading. This is one of the key points that I try to emphasize. People talk about the decline of bees. Honeybees have been declining in this country for a long time. Towards the end of the 1940s, after the war, people were coming back and looking for jobs, and they wanted to make money. And beekeeping was really not a way of making money. It was the price of honey was 2 or 3 cents a pound, and it was hard work, and it was really started declining then. So, I don't know if you can read that or not. At that time, they hit upon the idea of pollinating as a way of making money to supplement their income. Honey prices were low. There was crop changes, like for example, the clover was no longer widespread. There were other regions where new crops were being produced, like the sweet clover in the Midwest, Montana, Dakotas. If you went up there, you could make huge crops of honey if you had the vehicles. And so in order to get vehicles, the caliber that they needed to make more money. So pollination was one of these ways that they learned how to make money. But at the time, as you can see, the price was $5 to $10 per colony. And the beekeepers were afraid to charge more than that because they figured, well, we're going to kill the bees that lay the golden egg. If they charge too much, they're not going to want to rent the bees. So finally, 2006, the news is filled with gloom and doom. The bees are declining. Well, as I just told you, bees have been declining since the 50s, but people don't really want to think about that. People like to think that we've got a new problem. And there were some precipitous losses in the honeybee industry as a result of various pathogens, but this particular group is that where's Kathy? Who sponsored this anyway?
Well, it was a collaboration effort.
Anyway, so this was a huge consortium of people got together to study the decline of bees, the necessity for pollination, what could be done about it. And so this was an unprecedented undertaking where really a lot of attention was placed on the issue of pollination and how important is it to the country, national security, et cetera, and what are really the causes that are precipitating the decline of honeybees. And all the usual theories were brought out, sunspots and pesticides, pathogens, etc. And the conclusion, even back in 2006, was that it's a very, very complicated issue, that there is not one right answer, and the more you look at it, the more difficult it is to ferret out causes and effects. And so I think it's very important for people to avoid looking for simple answers to any of these problems. The problems are very, very complicated and very interconnected. But organizations like Bee-Friendly Farming and Partners for Sustainable Pollination are interested in promoting solutions. And one of the, several of the most important solutions that we know of are to increase habitat. There's got to be wider variety of foraging. Try to make try to make it easier for people to get information about beekeeping and really make beekeeping an honorable occupation again, the way it once was. So really, that's about all I have to say this morning.
some questions then. Saw a hand right there.
I have a question. I was thinking the other day, bee is the same as the verb to be. Did the word bee come from that idea of without bees or with bees?
No, but that's a good idea. She's saying it's not the fact that she's the word bee is the same as to be. I mean, obviously we're not going to do well without bees. But we'll still be. One of the things that I neglected to mention, and I think is very important, is that McGregor, when he was studying pollination, he realized early on that a small percentage of the plants that we eat are actually pollinated by insects. Most of the staples, grain and corn, for example, do not require bees. So, I want to make it very clear that when people say in the news, that without bees, we're all going to starve to death, that is not going to happen. That's just erroneous. Life would be a lot different without pollination. A lot of our favorite foods, such as apples and peaches and almonds, for example, would be much more expensive. But, I think presenting a worst case scenario like, without bees, we're all going to die, I think that's really counterproductive. The importance of bees cannot be underestimated, but it also shouldn't be exaggerated. Because when you start exaggerating your position, people start like, no, I don't think so. Questions? Well, I do better with questions. Yeah, I do. You're gonna have to. Yeah.
I think we have a question over here.
Yeah, this is a great picture. This picture actually hangs in my bedroom. My dad bought this years ago, and after he died, he left it to me. He was living in Australia at the time, and this is a early 1900s Australian artist. So yeah, this is one of my favorites.
We got a question over here. I'll use the mics to make sure everyone can hear.
I'm curious to know, in this history of beekeeping, how does Rudolf Steiner fit in anywhere? Or?
Rudolf Steiner. How many people know Rudolf Steiner? Oh. What kind of answer do you want?
What he did, or what he didn't do, or what he thought, or he talked about.
Well, that's a hard one. I could talk about Rudolf Steiner for about 45 minutes, but most of it would not be very flattering. I think that I appreciate the fact that Rudolf Steiner promoted beekeeping. There's a lot of these films that have been coming out, like Queen from the Sun. Queen of the Sun. That's a Rudolf Steiner line, right? He thought that the queen was from the sun, the thrones were from the moon, and there was some kind of cosmic energy involved, and that's pretty much where I stopped listening. But on the other hand, anything that promotes beekeeping, I'm not going to be negative towards anything that promotes beekeeping. Beekeeping needs all the friends it can get. I think that the truth about pollination, bees, and stuff like that is extremely interesting, so that we don't need to invent stuff. But I'm also an artist, and this really, the reason why this presentation went a little bit short was because I have the second half, which I'm going to lay on today, which is mostly photographs of pollinators and pollination taking place. And so I'm sorry, I sort of lengthened this a little bit. But anyway, like I said, do better with questions. So anyway, as an artist and a scientist, I used to feel almost torn in half by the fact that half of me was artistic, half of me was scientific. But in my later life, I learned to merge those two things. And a lot of times when I'm in my artistic mode, I just tell the scientist to shut up, and vice versa. Because I think that the beauty of life is in art and appreciation of the aesthetic parts of life. But we need scientific understanding as well, because there are a lot of serious problems that we have, and scientists are working on these problems you like it or not, you don't like the way they're solving these problems. You know, for example, with genetic engineering and nuclear power and all these things, a lot of those sound like that cure is worse than the disease, right? But they're the ones that are working on it because they're dedicated to solving the hard problems. And artists are working on the other side, which is to try and make life better by making it more interesting, more fun, and becoming sensitive. So I can't, you know, I'm not going to just say Rudolf Steiner had his head up to that. I just don't think that it's helpful. I think that, you know, in the Waldorf school, which developed out of Waldorf Steiner's ideas, which emphasizes literature and art and the importance of these things. To the extent that they appreciate science, then I think it's important for scientists to appreciate the contribution that artists and literary types make. But to the extent where they, you know, condemn each other, I think that's not helpful. Question? Yeah.
Do some plants have the ability, I'm going to talk about amaryllis. You know what an amaryllis is?
Yeah, of course.
Anyway, it looked like it had a stain in it. It had a physical stain. And yet, I think bulbs basically reproduce by creating new bulbs attached to it. Are there lots of plants that have two different ways of reproducing?
Yeah, I sort of get short shrift of that talk, right? When you start studying pollination, you find that there's a lot of plants that are self-pollinating. The parts are on the same flower itself. Now, the fact that they're on the same flower doesn't mean that the pollen is supposed to go from the the male to the female on that plant. But they have both organs, and in many cases, they are self-sterile. In other words, they can't fertilize themselves anymore. You or I can do that ourselves. Anyway, you have to, like McGregor, who was the one that studied this, he identified plants that are self-pollinating, that can pollinate each other, and then there's a whole class of plants that have to have different varieties. And this was a real problem early on. Because, for example, where I live, there's towns, there's orchards, there's fields, and you've got all these different varieties of everything. It never occurred to people that, that was important. And when they started putting in large acreages of apples and cherries, for example, in the West, let's say, well, just plant this one variety because that's the variety that everybody likes. And they had all these flowers and all these trees, and they wouldn't get any fruit. And then they thought, well, I heard that, bees were important. So they brought in hundreds of hives, and they still wouldn't get any fruit. And it finally occurred to them that you needed to have different varieties. Pears was one of the ones that was discovered early on in 1900, that pears required different varieties planted alongside them. And this is the same thing in the almond industry. You have to have different varieties of plants planted alongside. And what's interesting about this is that, like I said in the beginning, if you look at the reason for sexual reproduction, it just seems like a really stupid way of going about, reproducing. Go out and look for a mate. But there's a couple of things that are really, really beneficial. One of them is recombination. For example, if you take two very different individuals, recombine them, have kids, for example, the kids will come out completely different. And I don't know how many people have kids here, but you look at these kids, who the hell are they? It's not me. It's not like her. And so recombination is very, very important for producing the infinite variety of life that we see. And then the second thing is that survivability. In other words, if you can't fulfill this process, or for example, if conditions are not right, it won't happen. And so that this sort of like purging process purges out the weak and the unfit. Not 100%, because a lot of creatures find niches for able to survive in comfortable niches that are protected. So it's not as ruthless and bloodthirsty as it sometimes appears. And then the final thing is the whole thing of the rules of attraction. And I'm going to talk about that or show that a little bit more in the second half of the presentation. Is that the males are attracted to qualities that they want to have in their children. So this is true with animals, people, with plants. I mean, the attraction is a way of getting these different traits, these different qualities recombined and creating the object.
Right, time for one more quick question. Right here.
Does sexual reproduction in plants always result in the production of seeds?
Production of seeds?
Yeah.
That's a hard question. Why would it not? Well, no, I mean, no. Yeah.
You can, Peter will be around, of course, and he's going to do a presentation a little later as well, so we can check back with him during the lunch or later for more questions if you want to chat with Peter. We're going to keep things moving along.